There's a story you've probably heard. It goes like this. A remote civilization becomes obsessed with building giant stone heads. They chop down every tree on their island to move these statues. Without trees, their society collapses into chaos, warfare, and cannibalism. By the time Europeans arrive, they find a broken people living among the ruins of their own hubris. It's a perfect cautionary tale about environmental destruction and human greed. There's only one problem. It's not true. Or at least, it's not the whole truth. What if I told you that the collapse of Easter Island civilization wasn't primarily self-inflicted? What if the real catastrophe began not centuries before European contact, but precisely because of it? What if nearly everything we've been taught about Easter Island serves a narrative that has more to do with modern anxieties than historical accuracy? Tonight, we're not just exploring the mystery of the Moai statues. We're investigating how a sophisticated island civilization has been systematically misunderstood, misrepresented, and used as a morality tale that may tell us more about ourselves than about the people who actually lived there. This is the story of Rapa Nui. But it's also a story about how history gets written, who gets to write it, and what happens when indigenous voices are finally heard. Before we can understand what really happened on Easter Island, we need to understand why the traditional narrative became so powerful and so widely accepted. The collapse theory, popularized especially in the late 20th century, served a very specific purpose in Western environmental discourse. Here was a seemingly perfect case study, an isolated laboratory demonstrating what happens when humans exceed their resource base. The island became a metaphor, a warning sign, a preview of Earth's potential future if we didn't change our ways. Scientists, writers, and educators pointed to Easter Island as proof that civilizations could destroy themselves through ecological mismanagement long before any external threat arrived. This narrative appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and academic papers. It shaped public policy discussions and environmental advocacy. The problem is that this interpretation required ignoring, downplaying, or misinterpreting significant evidence that didn't fit the story. It required treating the Rapa Nui people as tragic figures in a morality play, rather than as complex human beings navigating real challenges with ingenuity and adaptation. The traditional collapse narrative rests on several key claims. First, that the Rapa Nui people deforested their entire island primarily to transport the Moai statues. Second, that this deforestation led to catastrophic soil erosion, agricultural failure, and famine. Third, that resource scarcity triggered a period of intense warfare, including the toppling of statues by rival clans. Fourth, that the population crashed dramatically before any European contact, possibly from 15,000 or more down to just a few thousand. And finally, that by the time Europeans arrived, they encountered the remnants of a society that had already collapsed under the weight of its own ecological sins. Each of these claims has been questioned, challenged, or substantially revised by contemporary research. But before we examine what actually happened, we need to ask why the collapse narrative was so appealing in the first place. Part of the answer lies in a very old impulse. For centuries, European observers have looked at indigenous societies and seen either noble savages living in harmony with nature or cautionary examples of human failure. Easter Island fit perfectly into the latter category. It allowed researchers to construct a narrative where the islanders were both victims and villains, destroyed by their own cultural practices before colonialism ever arrived. This interpretation had consequences beyond academic debate. It shaped how the Rapa Nui people themselves were perceived and treated. It influenced tourism, cultural preservation efforts, and even political sovereignty discussions. If the society had already collapsed before European contact, then the demographic catastrophe that followed colonization could be seen as merely finishing what the islanders had started themselves. This is not to say that researchers who promoted the collapse theory were acting in bad faith. Many genuinely believed they were uncovering important truths about human ecology. But science doesn't happen in a vacuum. The questions we ask, the evidence we prioritize, and the narratives we construct are all influenced by contemporary concerns and cultural assumptions. The story of Easter Island became less about what actually happened on a small Pacific island between roughly 1200 and 1800 CE, and more about what modern societies feared might happen to themselves. It became a parable, and like all parables, it simplified complex realities to deliver a clear moral message. But history isn't a parable. Real people lived on Rapa Nui. They built a society, developed cultural practices, adapted to environmental changes, and ultimately faced catastrophic disruption from outside forces. Their story deserves to be told on its own terms, not as a convenient allegory for contemporary anxieties. Let's rebuild the story of Easter Island from the ground up, using the best available archaeological, anthropological, and ecological evidence, much of it from research conducted in the last 2 decades. The first humans arrived on Rapa Nui sometime between 1100 and 1200 CE, though dates vary depending on the methodology used. These were Polynesian voyagers, probably from the Marquesas or Mangareva, who possessed extraordinary navigational skills. Their arrival was not accidental. Polynesian navigators understood ocean swells, star paths, bird behavior, and other natural indicators well enough to intentionally seek out and colonize islands across millions of square miles of open ocean. When they arrived, the island was indeed forested, though probably not as densely as some early estimates suggested. Pollen analysis indicates the presence of the Easter Island palm, which grew quite large, along with other trees and woody plants. Seabirds nested in huge numbers. The surrounding ocean provided fish, though not as abundantly as waters around some other Pacific islands due to the lack of a coral reef ecosystem. The settlers brought with them chickens, possibly pigs, though these may not have survived, and most significantly, the Polynesian rat. This last introduction would prove enormously consequential, though not in the way the settlers intended. Early Rapa Nui society developed along lines familiar from other Polynesian cultures. They cultivated sweet potatoes as their primary crop, using a technique called lithic mulching, where they placed stones on the soil to reduce erosion, retain moisture, and moderate temperature. This method was labor-intensive but effective in the island's challenging growing conditions. They fished, though again, not as extensively as populations on islands with better marine resources. They kept chickens, which became an important protein source. And they developed a stratified society organized into clans or lineages, each associated with particular territories and resources. It was within this social context that the Moai tradition emerged. The statues represented ancestors, specifically deified chiefs or important lineage heads. They were placed on platforms called ahu, which served as ceremonial centers for their respective clans. The statues faced inland, watching over the communities they represented, a detail that makes sense only when you understand them as ancestral protectors rather than mysterious monuments. The carving happened primarily at Rano Raraku, a quarry where the compressed volcanic tuff was relatively easy to work with stone tools. Teams of specialists carved the statues directly from the rock face, slowly defining the form before finally detaching it from the bedrock. The unfinished statues still visible at the quarry today show this process frozen in various stages. Moving the completed statues to their final locations required significant labor and coordination. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated that relatively small teams using rope systems could indeed transport and erect these statues using techniques available to the Rapa Nui people. The idea that statues were rocked back and forth in a walking motion remains controversial, but is certainly plausible. Other methods, including sledges, rollers, or combinations of techniques, were also possible. What's important is that none of these methods required impossible technology or explained the entire environmental transformation of the island by themselves. Yes, statue transportation probably required wood, both for levers and possibly for rollers or rails, but the scale of tree cutting required for statue movement alone would not have deforested the entire island. This brings us to the question of what did happen to the forests. Pollen cores and archaeological evidence confirm that the island's tree cover declined substantially between roughly 1200 and 1600 CE. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the island had few trees remaining. But the mechanism of deforestation was more complex than simply cutting trees to move statues. Research has shown that Polynesian rats, which reproduce rapidly in the absence of predators, consumed palm nuts at a rate that prevented forest regeneration. Rats don't eat fully mature palms, but they can completely prevent new palms from growing by eating every seed. Evidence from archaeological sites shows massive accumulations of gnawed palm nuts. Even if no trees had been deliberately cut, the rat population alone could have gradually transformed the island's ecology. Human tree cutting for agriculture, fires, canoe building, fuel, and yes, possibly statue transport accelerated this process, but it was the combination of human and rat impacts that proved decisive. And critically, this was a gradual transformation over several centuries, not a sudden catastrophic collapse. As the forest cover declined, Rapa Nui society adapted. They shifted increasingly toward chicken husbandry, building thousands of stone chicken houses across the island. They intensified agricultural production using lithic mulching. They developed alternative building materials and technologies that didn't require large timbers. Archaeological evidence suggests that population levels remained relatively stable or even increased during this period, not that they crashed. There's remarkably little evidence for the intense warfare that the collapse narrative requires. Yes, some moai were toppled, but this happened over an extended period and may have had multiple causes, including changing religious practices, clan conflicts, or even deliberate ritualized toppling as part of cultural transformation. There's no archaeological signature of a sudden, violent period of widespread warfare coinciding with environmental degradation. No mass graves, no fortifications on a scale suggesting desperate resource wars, no dramatic spike in trauma injuries and skeletal remains from this period. Instead, the evidence points to a society that faced genuine environmental challenges and responded with technological and social adaptations. It was not a society in freefall before European contact. It was a society in transition. On Easter Sunday 1722, Jacob Roggeveen and his ships encountered Rapa Nui. His accounts describe an island with limited tree cover but with thousands of inhabitants. He noted the massive statues and the organized society that maintained them. His visit was brief, but it marked the beginning of the end for independent Rapa Nui civilization. The real catastrophe wasn't self-inflicted ecological collapse, it was contact with the outside world. Over the following decades, European and American ships occasionally stopped on the island. Some of these visits were peaceful, involving trade or simple curiosity. Others were violent, involving kidnapping or killing islanders. But the most devastating impacts came from disease and slaving. Smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, and other diseases for which the Rapa Nui people had no immunity swept through the population in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then, beginning in the 1850s, Peruvian slave raiders began targeting Pacific islands, including Rapa Nui. In 1862 alone, approximately 1,500 Rapa Nui people were kidnapped and taken to work in Peru's guano mines and plantations, representing a huge portion of the remaining population. Under international pressure, Peru eventually agreed to repatriate the survivors. Of the 1,500 taken, only about 15 survived to return to Rapa Nui, and they brought smallpox with them. The epidemic that followed was catastrophic. By the 1870s, the population of Easter Island had fallen to approximately 100 people. Let me repeat that, 100 people, from an estimated population of several thousand at contact, possibly more, to just 100 survivors. This is what demographic collapse actually looks like, and it happened not because the Rapa Nui people destroyed their environment, but because they encountered colonialism, disease, and slavery. The cultural knowledge lost during this period is almost impossible to calculate. The ability to read the Rongo Rongo script unique to Easter Island was lost. Many oral traditions disappeared. Technical knowledge about statue carving and transport vanished. Religious practices were suppressed by Christian missionaries who arrived in the 1860s. the survivors faced not just population collapse, but cultural erasure. In 1880s, Chile annexed Easter Island, and the remaining Rapa Nui people were confined to a small settlement while the rest of the island was turned over to a sheep ranch operated by a Chilean-British company. For decades, the Rapa Nui people lived essentially as prisoners on their own island, their movement restricted, their language and culture suppressed, their land stolen. This is the context that the traditional collapse narrative erases or minimizes. By focusing on alleged pre-contact collapse, it shifts attention away from the very real and well-documented catastrophe that followed European arrival. It turns a story of colonization into a story of ecological mismanagement. It makes the Rapa Nui people responsible for their own destruction when the evidence clearly shows that external forces shattered their society. The environmental transformation of Easter Island was real, and it did present challenges. But characterizing it as civilizational suicide ignores both the adaptation the Rapa Nui people demonstrated over centuries and the overwhelming impact of disease, slavery, and colonization.
Setting aside the collapse myth allows us to see Rapa Nui society more clearly and appreciate its genuine achievements. This was not a society trapped in a death spiral of its own making. It was a sophisticated culture that developed unique solutions to the challenges of living on one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. The Moai themselves represent an extraordinary engineering and artistic achievement. We're talking about nearly 1,000 statues carved from solid rock using only stone tools. The largest successfully transported and erected Moai stands about 30 feet tall and weighs roughly 80 tons. At the quarry, one unfinished statue would have been over 70 feet tall if completed. Even the average Moai, at about 13 feet tall and 14 tons, required enormous skill and labor to create. The artistic style is distinctive and immediately recognizable. The elongated heads, the strong brows, the subtle differences in facial features suggest these were not generic representations but specific individuals. The eyes, originally inlaid with white coral and red volcanic stone, would have given the statues an even more powerful presence. The platform structures, or ahu, that supported the Moai were themselves feats of construction. These were precisely fitted stone platforms, some extending over 300 feet in length, built without mortar. The engineering required to erect multi-ton statues on these platforms was considerable. The statues had to be raised vertically, balanced, and secured, all using rope, wood, and stone levers. Agricultural innovation on Rapa Nui deserves more attention than it typically receives. The lithic mulching technique I mentioned earlier involved placing stones on cultivated fields to create a microclimate that protected sweet potato plants from wind, retained moisture, reduced soil temperature fluctuations, and enriched soil through weathering. This method worked well in Rapa Nui's challenging conditions, characterized by poor soil, limited rainfall, and constant wind. Archaeological surveys have identified extensive areas of these rock gardens, evidence of intensive agricultural management. The islanders also developed coastal cultivation areas using seepage from freshwater sources and built shelters and windbreaks to protect crops. They weren't passively watching their environment deteriorate, they were actively managing it with sophisticated techniques. Social organization on Rapa Nui was complex. The island was divided among several clans or mata, each with its own chief and territory. Within these clans, there were further distinctions of status and role. Specialists existed for various tasks, including statue carving, platform construction, canoe building, navigation, and religious functions. The position of paramount chief, or Ariki Mao, held both political and religious significance, mediating between the human and spiritual worlds. Competition between clans may have driven Moai construction, with each group seeking to honor their ancestors and demonstrate their power and prestige through increasingly impressive statues and platforms. This competitive dynamic doesn't necessarily imply destructive rivalry. In many Polynesian societies, such competition occurred within cultural frameworks that regulated conflict and maintained overall social stability. The Rongo-Rongo script, found on wooden tablets and a few other objects, remains one of the Pacific's great mysteries. While we've lost the ability to read it, its very existence demonstrates intellectual sophistication. Only a handful of cultures worldwide independently invented writing systems. If Rongo-Rongo indeed represents true writing, which remains debated, it would place Rapa Nui among that exclusive group. Even if it served a more limited symbolic or mnemonic function, it still reflects complex cultural practices that extended beyond simple survival. All of this, the monumental architecture, the agricultural innovation, the social complexity, the artistic and intellectual achievements, happened in one of the most isolated and challenging environments humans have ever permanently inhabited. The Rapa Nui people didn't destroy themselves. They built a remarkable civilization in an unlikely place and maintained it for centuries until external forces overwhelmed them.
Given the evidence, why does the collapse narrative remain so influential? Why do textbooks, documentaries, and popular discussions continue to present Easter Island as a cautionary tale of self-destruction when the research no longer supports that interpretation? Part of the answer is simply institutional inertia. Once a narrative becomes established in educational materials and popular consciousness, it takes time for new research to filter through and replace it. Textbooks get updated slowly. Documentaries made decades ago continue circulating. People who learned the collapse story in school naturally repeat it. But there's more to it than that. The collapse narrative serves contemporary purposes. It provides a clear, dramatic example for environmental advocacy. It offers a simple story with a clear moral. It confirms existing beliefs about the relationship between human behavior and environmental degradation. A more nuanced story about gradual environmental change, cultural adaptation, and catastrophic disruption through colonization is harder to package and doesn't deliver the same clear message. There's also a tendency in Western thought to romanticize indigenous peoples as either perfectly harmonious with nature or as tragic examples of ecological failure. Both stereotypes deny indigenous people full humanity. The idea that the Rapa Nui people were somehow more virtuous or more foolish than other humans, that they were incapable of both wise resource management and environmental transformation, that they existed outside the normal range of human cultural development, all of these assumptions reflect colonial thinking patterns, even when they're deployed for environmentalist purposes. The real Rapa Nui people were neither ecological saints nor environmental villains. They were humans dealing with real challenges using the knowledge and technology available to them. They made choices that transformed their environment over time, as nearly all agricultural societies have done. They adapted to those transformations, and they ultimately faced catastrophe not from their own environmental impacts, but from contact with expanding European colonial powers. Correcting the Easter Island narrative matters for several reasons. First, and most importantly, it matters for the Rapa Nui people themselves, who continue to live on the island today. Their history has been appropriated and distorted to serve others' purposes. Restoring a more accurate understanding of that history is a basic matter of respect and justice. The current population of Rapa Nui, now several thousand, includes descendants of the survivors of the 19th century catastrophe. They've worked for decades to revive cultural practices, protect archaeological sites, and assert greater control over their homeland and its representation. When outsiders continue promoting collapse narratives that blame pre-contact Rapa Nui society for its own destruction, it undermines these efforts and perpetuates harmful stereotypes. Second, the true story of Easter Island actually offers more useful lessons than the simplified collapse myth. Understanding how societies adapt to environmental change over long time periods, how cultural practices evolve in response to new conditions, how colonial contact can devastate even resilient societies, these are genuinely important lessons with contemporary relevance. Third, the Easter Island case illustrates how scientific narratives can be shaped by cultural assumptions and contemporary concerns in ways that distort historical understanding. Recognizing this should make us more cautious about our own interpretations and more willing to revisit established narratives when new evidence emerges. The story of how the Easter Island narrative changed over time is itself instructive. Early European visitors saw the statues and couldn't imagine how primitive natives could have built them, so they speculated about lost civilizations or ancient European influence.
20th-century researchers concerned about environmental degradation saw the island as proof that humans could destroy their own resource base. Contemporary scholars, more attuned to colonial history and indigenous perspectives, see a society that adapted to environmental change but was ultimately devastated by outside forces. Each generation tends to see in Easter Island a reflection of its own preoccupations. That's not necessarily wrong, but we should be aware that we're doing it and try to distinguish between what the evidence actually shows and what we want or expect it to show.
Modern Easter Island exists in a complex position, physically part of Chile, but culturally Polynesian, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's also someone's home, a tourist destination where ancient monuments stand alongside contemporary communities. The Rapa Nui people have made remarkable efforts to preserve and revive their cultural heritage despite the catastrophic losses of the 19th century. Language revitalization programs teach Rapa Nui language to new generations. Traditional dance, music, and crafts have been maintained or reconstructed. The annual Tapati Rapa Nui Festival celebrates indigenous culture through competitions in traditional skills and arts. Archaeological sites are protected, and many toppled moai have been restored to their platforms, allowing visitors to see these monuments as they were intended to be seen. But significant challenges remain. The island's political status continues to be contentious. While technically part of Chile, many Rapa Nui people advocate for greater autonomy or even independence. Questions about land rights, resource control, and political representation remain unresolved. Tourism brings economic benefits, but also raises concerns about cultural commodification, environmental impact, and whether the Rapa Nui people themselves control how their culture and history are presented to visitors. The island receives tens of thousands of tourists annually, all coming to see the moai and experience this remote location. Managing this influx while protecting archaeological sites and maintaining community well-being requires constant negotiation. There are also ongoing debates about the interpretation and management of the archaeological heritage itself. Who has the right to determine how the moai are studied, restored, and presented? What role should Rapa Nui people play in archaeological research on their own island? How should traditional knowledge and oral history be integrated with scientific archaeology? These aren't just academic questions, they're about respect, sovereignty, and who controls the narrative. Increasingly, research projects on Easter Island involve collaboration with Rapa Nui communities, incorporate traditional knowledge, and recognize indigenous intellectual property rights. This represents progress, but it's an ongoing process. Climate change presents new challenges for Easter Island. Rising sea levels threaten coastal archaeological sites. Changing weather patterns affect the island's limited freshwater resources. Erosion endangers monuments that have stood for centuries. These environmental changes will require adaptive management strategies to protect the island's cultural heritage. The story of modern Easter Island is one of resilience and recovery. From a population of about 100 survivors in the 1870s, the Rapa Nui people have rebuilt their community. They've preserved enough of their cultural heritage to maintain a distinct identity. They continue fighting for recognition, respect, and control over their homeland. This ongoing story of survival and cultural continuity deserves to be part of any discussion of Easter Island, not just the ancient history or the collapse debate. The Rapa Nui people are not relics of the past. They're a living community navigating complex contemporary challenges while honoring their ancestors and heritage.